Hi, we're going to talk about natural disasters in this video, and we can start with a definition from the United Nations as a serious disruption of the functioning of society causing widespread human, material, or environmental losses which exceed the ability of affected society to cope using only its own resources. And uh, something we should point out is this definition could equally apply to what we might call social disasters. And these are these sorts of mishaps that result from human activity. And something to bear in mind as we do study natural disasters is that the line between social and natural disasters is sometimes hazy because we often have a part in influencing what's happening in the natural world. Um, and when we look at the types of disasters, especially those related to the climate due to climate change and human activities related to climate change, there's certainly some social element to these disasters, but large-scale storms like hurricanes, localized storms, drought, flooding, so both extremes of precipitation, fires, which seem to be at a level we haven't seen before, particularly in California, then oceanic changes, which will influence weather patterns and lead to extreme warmth or cold, depending on where you're located, which can have ripple effects in terms of things like agriculture and other industries that depend on some kind of climatic Goldilocks zone. The other branch of natural disasters are geological. So here we have earthquakes um, resulting from the movement of tectonic plates. Volcanoes are also related to this. Tsunamis or tidal waves are often some of the aftermath of an earthquake. Some of these earthquakes happen in the ocean and send massive tidal waves or tsunamis towards land masses, causing a great deal of damage. And land instability. Land can subside, and certainly with climate change and the rising ocean level, a lot of land is being put underwater. So these are all concerns. Something else I'd like to point out is, although we kind of breezed past it, flooding is probably the most widespread and damaging, although certainly not the scariest. But when you look at the sheer amount of economic damage that results from flooding, it is one that causes a great deal of damage. And much of it, and we'll look at prevention in a moment, but much of this could be mitigated or prevented. So, natural dis- natural hazards are threatening events. The probability of occurrence of a potentially damaging phenomenon within a given time period or area, according to the United Nations. So, from 1990 to 1999, about half of damages were from wildfires, 27% from storms, with over 4.7 million people affected, and 3,600 deaths. When you compare that with the decade following that, 2000, 2009, you can see that climatic uh, changes, particularly those influencing storms, have really been in effect. Hurricane damage and flooding, especially. So 90% of damages in that decade were from those types of events, and we can expect to see 2010, 2020 resurgence. There's certainly a great deal of damage from wildfires and continuing damage from storms. So really, just a combination. And well, the 2000, 2009, over 20 million people were affected. So the fivefold effects in terms of the number of people affected, and a 25% increase in deaths related to natural disasters. And these are official counts. It's hard to say, you know, deaths or other types of damages that might have resulted from ripple effects. So, what creates natural disasters? That's an important question when we're thinking about prevention and mitigation. So, the degree to which a population is exposed to a hazard is something that underpins risk. So, if you live on the coast, of course, you're more exposed to hurricanes. If you live near fault lines, you're more exposed to earthquakes. So, there are some amount of risk that we can anticipate, some kind of probability of a hazard taking place. Greenhouse gases are much more dissipated across the planet. Uh, it's not necessarily the case that the source of greenhouse gases are going to be the same places that feel the effects. And in fact, it's usually not the case. Most of the major greenhouse gas producing countries are in the global north, yet most of the hazards and disasters resulting from uh, greenhouse gas climate change are in the global south. So it's really quite an inequitable distribution of blame and consequences, frankly. So dealing with natural disasters means trying to assess climate changes as well as levels of risk. And certainly those people who work in the field of risk management, who work for maybe insurance companies, believe in climate change and all of the consequences of that are taking place. So responding means hazard mitigation. That's long-term reduction in the effects of natural hazard events. Uh, so mitigation is one strategy. Climate change and disaster management, usually this happens after the fact, trying to mitigate the damage somehow. But establishing a set of no regrets policies is another strategy, actions that make good sense to implement, whether or not the consequences of climate change turn out to be as bad as we think they will. So just taking a path of precaution in terms of where we build our communities and taking risk into consideration. We wouldn't want to build homes in floodplains, for instance. Even floodplains that are 500-year floodplains, we're finding out are maybe 100-year or 50-year. So these are some of the consequences of climate change, is just more unpredictability. So four mitigation strategies we can look at here. One, avoiding the impact, which means moving away altogether. So this happened after Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, for instance. Several thousand people were moved, many of them to makeshift structures. I know one of the arenas in Houston, Texas, was retrofitted to house thousands of people with cots, and so basically a village was built. Another strategy is lessen the impact by modifying locations. So move away to a lesser impacted area. So this was also used after Hurricane Katrina, where temporary travel trailer parks were created nearby, so people maybe had less disruption. They could maybe maintain some work or whatever was still intact. They could still participate in their communities. Uh, Another approach is modifying the design of our communities. So, if you know you live in a floodplain and moving is not an option, then establishing robust and reliable levees is a strategy. Now that is something. Lake Pontchartrain was held back by levees in New Orleans. So when Katrina hit, unfortunately those levees were not maintained. So this modified design was not sustainable. It turns out it was breached, and when the lake breached the levees, that's what caused most of the devastation. The fourth strategy is offsetting the impact, so compensating with money. So mitigation settlements are part of the story here, and certainly this is something that property owners are interested in pursuing, especially after dealing with a great deal of loss. So the four phases of emergency management are mitigation, preparedness, response, and recovery. And hopefully more is done in advance so that you know the damage later is lessened. So in terms of the capitals, the different community capitals, and the results of natural disaster, we can look at physical capital. Again, billions of dollars are lost in flooding and hurricane related events, wildfires, and those sorts of things. So that is a major concern, is the physical capital. Capital. The environment can also be changed or destroyed in irreparable ways. Although, interestingly, a certain amount of disasters are expected, or certain environments have evolved for various disasters. Forests, it turns out, have evolved with wildfires. And so there's new thinking in terms of the role of fires in some habitats, but that does not account for all wildfires, which certainly exceed, the ability of forests to recover in many cases. So financial capital, without a doubt, there's a great deal of loss that happens in terms of money. In terms of politics, when it comes to responding to disasters, there can be a great deal of corruption that takes place. So leadership becomes crucial there. And if people are moving from a community, you lose a lot of institutional memory. And some of these people leaving will be leaders, so you're going to lose leadership. And especially when people are relocated, social capital can be destroyed irreparably. If people lose ties to their neighbors, to their communities, and have to start over somewhere else, then it's a total devastation, right? So you're losing your network. Culturally, this same sorts of things can happen. The traditions, the customs. If a community is just not able to bounce back, then a lot of the culture of the community is lost, including the physical aspects of the community, the important landmarks, and so forth. Once they're gone, you can't get them back sometimes. And then the human capital, right? People are injured, people are killed, families have to deal with a great deal of loss. There's often a great deal of psychological distress following natural disasters. And sometimes employers, are faced with decisions about relocating or trying to rebuild that are often very difficult and can leave the economy in shambles. So natural disasters, they can occur almost anywhere, although certainly there are risk factors that can be predicted to some extent, but with the changing climate and other moving targets, it's hard to make accurate predictions. So analyzing risk is important, uh, and trying to at least pin down some of the vulnerabilities and prepare in advance, at least have contingency plans in the case of disasters is important. Thank you.